Shapiro rage quit his position at Breitbart and took shots at Trump, Steve Bannon, and everyone else he could on his way out. This, for myself and many people, was a pivotal moment. It's where the extent of Shapiro's anti-Trump bias began to become clear. Why would Ben Shapiro, someone that claims to hold facts above feelings, take the side of a woman lying about being physically abused by Trump's campaign manager? Well, to hurt Trump, of course. It's no secret that Shapiro's website, Daily Wire, was given startup capital by Texas oil billionaires Ferris and Dan Wilkes. These are the same Wilkes brothers that in 2015 gave $15 million in funding to a pro-Ted Cruz super PAC. Curiously, I didn't hear Ben Shapiro mention this massive financial conflict of interest in any of his podcasts during the 2016 primaries, where he bashed Trump and promoted Cruz. Now, let's not get too far afield here. The purpose of this video is not to rehash the 2016 Republican primaries or the intra-party conflicts that emerged as a result. In today's video, we're going to hear two stories, two sets of ideas and policies for how a nation's demographics and borders should be managed. Both stories are written by Ben Shapiro. In one story, Shapiro describes strong border controls and ethnic homogeneity as essential, the basis of a nation, integral for any nation that wants to defend its people. And in the other story, strong immigration controls become less important. The economy is the priority. Ethnic and racial identity politics are evil and divisive, things that should be tamped down and ignored. And demographics, they don't really matter at all. Let's begin with the second story. Let's begin by looking at how Ben Shapiro talks about the United States, the American demographic situation, and immigration into the United States. One of Ben's most famous tweets is one he put out in June of 2017, where he said, quote, "I don't give a damn about the so-called browning of America," referring, of course, to America's changing racial demographics and the fact that America has gone from being an 85% European-American country in the 1960s to a country where European Americans will be the minority by the 2040 or so. Color doesn't matter. Ideology does. Now, astute observers of sociology and political science will note from the outset that there are problems with this position. Shapiro claims not to care. In fact, he doesn't give a damn if America becomes majority-minority. That wouldn't matter to Ben, as long as there are conservatives that support his vision of conservatism, low taxes, and a strong military. That is a-okay with him. But of course, as we all know, America's demographic shift comes with an unavoidable political shift. You've heard the numbers by now, but let's refresh again. The vast majority of non-European Americans believe in bigger government and more social programs. The Second Amendment, for example, 66% of blacks and 75% of Hispanics believe the government's priority with firearms should be gun control, not protecting the Second Amendment. Whites are the other way around. 75% of blacks and 72% of Hispanics believe that hateful speech is an act of violence. The minority of whites believe this. 70% of both blacks and Hispanics believe that hateful speech should be banned. If the 2016 presidential race were left up to European American voters, Donald Trump would have won in a landslide. And if it had been up to non-European American voters, Hillary Clinton would have won every single state. 50 out of 50. There's no question that as America becomes more diverse, America becomes more left-wing. We know that America's growing embrace of radical left-wing socialism over the past few decades is due to changing demographics. Children and grandchildren of Latin American and Eastern European communists have come to America and are treating the U.S. as another host country for their parasitic ideals to take hold. You think this is far-fetched? Look into the Trotskyite roots of neoconservatism. We've seen this phenomenon manifest itself many different times in many different ways. So, as the country's demographics change, or if you prefer Shapiro's terminology, as America browns, it becomes increasingly politically left-wing. There will be a point in the next 20 years or so where it becomes demographically impossible for Republicans to win a presidential election. All it's going to take is for Texas and Florida to become slightly more Hispanic, slightly more diverse. And at that point, Republicans will no longer be electable in the presidential race. The demographic change is happening as a result of several factors. Number one is the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, also known as the Hart-Celler Act, which changed the target of America's immigration system from Western Europe to Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Capitalism is partially to blame as well. Companies, given free rein and assisted by the government, have begun seeking out international talent to bring to the U.S. and work for them, for a percentage of what they would have paid Americans. Are there Americans to do these jobs? Of course there are. But those Americans ask for things like a family wage and days off. Migrant workers are happy to live 3 to a bedroom with no vacation time and no sick days. We can't let corporations off the hook here. They profit from cheap labor, and they use those profits to lobby our politicians to keep the borders open. Now, of course, we could talk for ages about the winners and losers of the Great American Population Replacement. I would encourage all of my viewers to look further into this topic. Look at which organizations and international interests are pushing mass migration propaganda and narratives. But that's more content than we have time to get into here. Let's get back to Ben Shapiro. He doesn't care about America's changing demographics, despite the political implications. Conservatives, this is the guy that's supposed to be fighting for you. But he doesn't care that you are being replaced so quickly in your own country that you will inevitably become an ethnic and political powerless minority. If he were fighting for the interests of conservative Americans, presumably he would be fighting for policies like closed borders and a temporary moratorium on immigration. Here are more of Ben Shapiro's stances on immigration and demographics when it comes to America. And keep in mind, these are just from his tweets and articles on Daily Wire. There are certainly more examples in the hundreds and hundreds of hours of podcast audio as well. According to Ben, quote, "There are crappy countries, but judging immigrants by their countries of origin is wrong. Quote, not all illegal immigrants should stay. Not all illegal immigrants should leave. Why can't we decide on a person-by-person basis? Quote, I would trade 100 million immigrants who don't take benefits for 100 million Americans mooching welfare today. But that's not the deal. I find that tweet in particular to be interesting. It shows how many neoconservative elites don't really see America as a nation of people. They see the United States as nothing more than an economic zone, and their political prerogative is maximizing GDP, not doing the right thing for the American people. According to Ben, 1. America's changing demographics don't matter. 2. We shouldn't judge immigrants by their country of origin. 3. Some illegal immigrants should be allowed to stay. And 4. The state should ideally import economically productive people and expel the economically unproductive, regardless of citizenship. That's a fairly typical mindset for many neoconservatives, and it makes logical sense. If you view the United States as an economic zone and not a nation made up of a common people with a common history and heritage, then why would you care about changing demographics? Why would you care if economically productive illegal aliens stay? And why wouldn't you be okay with expelling Americans that are economically unproductive and importing millions of foreigners? If your interest is in protecting big capital, this all makes perfect sense. But now let's let Ben tell us a different story. A story about a country that he doesn't just see as an economic zone. A country he sees as a nation with laws, strong borders, and the moral right, no, moral imperative to protect its demographic makeup. Thankfully, we don't have to chase down tweets to hear this story. Shapiro wrote it himself in a column titled "Transfer is Not a Dirty Word." This column was written by Mr. Shapiro in 2003. Raise your hand if you were shocked at the breakdown of the so-called Middle East roadmap. If you're raising your hand, give yourself a nice hard slap across the chops. Maybe that will wake you up from your reverie of self-delusion. The roadmap was doomed from the start. The Arab enmity for Jews in the state of Israel allows for no peace process. The time for half measures has passed. Bulldozing houses of homicide bombers is useless. Instituting curfews in Arab-populated cities is useless. Roadblocks, tough fences, midnight negotiations, and ceasefires are useless. Some have rightly suggested that Israel be allowed to decapitate the terrorist leadership of the Palestinian Authority. But this, too, is only a half measure. The ideology of the Palestinian population is indistinguishable from that of its terrorist leadership. Half measures merely postpone our realization that the Arab dream of Israel's destruction. Without drastic measures, the Arab dream will come true. In the short term, the establishment of a Palestinian state based in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza cuts Israel to the bone. In some places, Israel would be an unthinkable 9 miles wide. In the long term, the growth of the hostile Israeli Arab population within pre-1967 Israel bodes ill for the future of the Jewish state. As University of Haifa professor Arnon Stauffer says, the trends and indicators all point to an economic and ecological catastrophe waiting to happen and the death knell of the ideological dream of a Jewish state. Here's the bottom line. If you believe that the Jewish state has a right to exist, then you must allow Israel to transfer the Palestinians and the Israeli Arabs from Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and Israel proper. It's an ugly solution, but it is the only solution. And it is far less ugly than the prospect of bloody conflict ad infinitum. When two populations are constantly enmeshed in conflict, it is insane to suggest that somehow deep-seated ideological change will miraculously occur, allowing the two sides to live together. End quote. I'm reading this and I can't help think, where's the lie though? Shapiro is absolutely correct in his observations here. When two populations are constantly enmeshed in conflict, it is insane to suggest that somehow deep-seated ideological change will miraculously occur, allowing the two sides to live together. And that's a principle that doesn't just apply in Israel. It applies anywhere you have hostile populations forced to share the same territory. Let's be clear about what Shapiro is proposing here. He's saying that if you believe Israel has a right to exist, then you must be okay with allowing Israel to forcibly transfer the Palestinians and Israeli Arabs out of Gaza, out of Israel, out of Judea, and out of Samaria. In other words, peaceful ethnic cleansing. Quote, unfortunately, this insanity, referring to the current state of affairs, not his proposed population transfer, is generally accepted as the only way forward. President Bush accepts it because it is politically palatable. The Arabs accept it because for them, it is a Trojan horse. The Israelis accept it because they're afraid if they expel the Arabs, they will be called Nazis. For anyone who lived through the Holocaust or has relatives who died in it, being called a Nazi is unspeakably terrible. That is the secret weapon of the Arabs. Anytime the Jews get wise and threaten mass expulsion of Arabs, the Arabs pull out their big stick, equating Nazism with Zionism. And at this point in the column, Shapiro goes on to make the historical case for forcible ethnic transfer of entire populations. In order to protect Israel's interests and homogeneity, Shapiro is endorsing the full-scale deportation of Palestinians and Arabs from the whole of Judea, Samaria, Israel proper, and Gaza, allowing all of the contested territory to fall into Israeli, not Palestinian, control. Shapiro strictly opposes diversity for Israel. He's proposing transferring not only the Palestinians, but also the Israeli Arabs in the name of keeping conflicting groups away from one another. Fundamentally, Shapiro views Israel as a nation, a sovereign people with a sovereign state. And that's good. I believe in nationhood for all. He speaks about Israel in this article as the, quote, Jewish state. And he understands that civic nationalism, that is, just handing someone citizenship and expecting them to assimilate, doesn't work. As he says in the piece, quote, in the long term, the growth of the hostile Israeli Arab population within Israel bodes ill for the future of the Jewish state. Certainly, pursuing deportation and relocation of so many people wouldn't be free. There would definitely be a large fiscal cost, but there is no cost too great to bear to defend one's nation and people. In America, Shapiro contests that some illegal aliens must be allowed to stay. There's a cost to deporting them, right? And some of them are, I'm sure, economically productive people. But in Israel, full-scale deportation is an ugly solution, but the only solution. The children of the Palestinians he's talking about don't even get to vote and influence Israeli elections, as opposed to the children of illegal aliens in America that absolutely vote in American elections. In America, we have to be nuanced and careful, but Israel gets the right to deport everyone, even Israeli Arab citizens. And finally, in America, changing demographics do not matter. The browning of America doesn't matter. Ideology does. But strangely, in Shapiro's commentary on Israel, we don't see the same deference to ideology over ethnicity. Shapiro doesn't say, for example, I don't give a damn about the browning of Israel. Ethnicity doesn't matter. Support for Likud does. No, he doesn't say that because that would be dumb. Shapiro instead contends that Israeli Arabs must be deported. It is, after all, Israeli land. And yes, Palestinians may have been living there for hundreds of years, but that doesn't matter. They don't have the same historical claim to the land that Israelis do. Forcible ethnic transfer of populations, as Ben Shapiro says, isn't a dirty word. It's the inevitable and peaceful solution. This may be one of my biggest problems with Ben Shapiro. He has two entirely different sets of standards, one for the US and one for Israel. In America, changing demographics don't matter. In Israel, changing demographics spell the death of the nation-state. I would love it if these topics were able to be debated and discussed. I do think Shapiro is a very intelligent guy, and he's very good at debating, so it would be great if you were able to have a conversation with someone to his political right about these topics. Why does he believe demographics are irrelevant in America? And why the different standard with Israel? Why should Americans not judge people based on their country of origin? But it's okay for Ben to say that Arabs just like to blow stuff up and live in sewage. Well, when Nick Fuentes tried to have that conversation with him, he got called an anti-Semite. Facts don't care about your feelings, and it appears that name-calling and socially shaming to dodge a conversation doesn't care about facts.